Welcome in. It's the Fantasy Sanctuary Draftkings Best Ball show, joined as usual by my good friend Colm from Rotoviz. We are drafting each and every week, ping-ponging back between the Rotoviz channel and here in the Fantasy Sanctuary. And we're not going to waste any time today. We're getting straight into a draft. So if you're here in the chat and ready to draft with us, let's go. Colm, before we got going and whilst we wait for this room to fill up, which won't take long because it was 12 or 12, one thing which I've been thinking about a bit this week whilst putting together some content is what's one thing that you wish you knew about best ball when you first started playing? And for people who don't know, you could tell us how long you've been playing best ball for, because I know it's a few years more than me.
Yeah, it's quite a while. I was pitching on Rotoviz OT this week. I believe it's actually the episode that's going to come out on Wednesday, but the conversation I've seen on Twitter over the last couple of days has been, this is the 5th best ball summer. And I would like to highlight that best ball is around for more than 5 years. And obviously it has really exploded and expanded, but it growing in popularity was even happening beyond that. But back to the old MFL 10 days back in my fantasy league and playing best ball, I would have to imagine now at this point, at least 10 years. We're in that range of outcomes in terms of the distance that has been going on. But the game has changed and evolved quite a bit. And we will have time to talk about this because we're drafting at the 11 spot here in this draft. But I think there's a huge amount that has changed. And it's kind of one of those that probably deeper reflection is needed to go back just to see how much it has changed. The episode that I teased there will come out on Wednesday. We talked about the MFL 10 of death. Some people may be aware of it, but for a long time, that was where I took the kind of ADP and the changes in ADP that they would come from. Some of the best drafters in the world take place in it. Like Sean Siegel, my co-host, is in it, but Denny Carter's in it, Pat Thorman, Adam Levitan, just a huge, just a huge murderers row of fantasy football names. Mike Clay is one of the names in there as well. So for a long time, that was where you would see ADP shift and ADP settle. Obviously now we have best ball with DraftKings and Underdog, and it's changes. We kind of have an idea of it much sooner, but you will see them take stands on certain players in that format, which then can impact how people are drafting in these sort of leagues with players of that caliber having player takes in higher or lower ranges than they would be going in normal leagues. And you do see even in that the way quarterbacks are drafted versus what happens in best ball now, some changes throughout the course of that particular format. But I think there's just so much that has changed, Tom, in terms of we look at stacking even at the start was something that was considered but not huge. And it used to be much, much easier back in the day to take 2 quarterbacks in the window, because 10 years ago we were starting to get into that 0 RB late quarterback range. That's another name that's in it, is our buddy JJ Zacharyson. So there's a lot of things that have changed. There's a lot of things then that have kind of zagged back to where they kind of were originally, and now it's really pushed into that heavy wide receiver 0 RB lean with a lot of this information. So some of the things that I think that have changed have been for the better. A lot of that stuff that has changed has been stuff that at Rotoviz, we've been using the tools and working into our drafts for a long, long time. So that's probably a disappointing part. There's a benefit of like what you have been talking about for years is becoming more talked about, but there's also the detriment of that is the stuff we talked about for years is now not as easy to take advantage of in drafts. But that's the thing I keep highlighting about people still do certain aspects of those roster builds and roster constructions incorrectly. We'll see how this draft goes today if we can do a correct roster build. But you're more so in the near term in terms of some of the changes. Anything that you wish that you had known back then? I guess the part of the MFL 10s where they were simple 12-team leagues, you weren't looking to, have such game theory that you were going to beat teams in week 17. It was accumulative points throughout the course of the season. We are on the clock, though, so I'll let you, or we're on the clock in one pick. I'll let you answer that after. But that is some of the areas of this particular format that has changed as you're looking against a grid and turning it into a little bit of a DFS slate for those last couple of weeks of the season to try and win these tournaments. But
yeah,
I think everything is going in the right direction for best ball, rather than, the stuff that we could have knew 10 years ago wouldn't really have helped us as much to win those leagues because they were 12-team leagues.
Yes, we are on the clock. McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Brees Hall went 1, 2, 3 in this draft. So at the 11 pick, we could take Garrett Wilson here
Yeah.
if you like. I've been trying to draft a little bit
Yeah.
more of him, but that's certainly a pretty wild start to be for the drafter at the 104 to be able to get CD Lamb. The drafter even at 108 to be able to get Justin Jefferson. I think that's the kind of start which
this is a crazy start, because we could get another wide receiver here on the turn, which would lead to us to probably take another wide receiver, and that would lead to 3 running backs starting it off. So Nico Collins does go. I think we're probably back to our boy Drake London, unless you want to go with Jamar Gibbs here. What are you feeling?
No, I'm happy with Drake London. I haven't drafted as much of him over the last couple of weeks as I would have liked to, so I'm quite happy with that. And yeah, it gives us 2 players starting on week 12 buys, but I just don't worry about that this early in the draft. Nico Collins was the pick at the 201 before us, which again, sometimes you get these kind of drafts where it goes a little crazy. Plenty of people in the chat saying, this start is wild, running back mania. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see how these teams out of the 101, 102, 103 take things now.
Continue.
Because, I mean, on one hand, it seems a little suboptimal to take those running backs quite that early. But on the other hand, you might be able to flip the build and build something out with a hero running back build that you're just not getting from the 107, the 108, perhaps. So
The part that really stands out for that is the disadvantage of trying to set it up. Now, you will get a combination of players in rounds 3, rounds 4, rounds 5 that will be different to if you're drafting Bijan or Brees at the 10 pick, at the 11 pick. But the tricky part, if you're doing a hero RB build, is the wide receivers you can tend to put with them at that particular point will be, given those drafters drafting at regular ADP, that little bit more of an advantage than it. So we'll see how they play out. But very intriguing that we get 3 off the bat there, followed up by that huge run of wide receivers. And one of the things that we kind of have done recently is we've had draft picks in the kind of 108, 107, 109 range when we've drafted together. So that puts you in an area where usually you're looking at those running backs, and then Wilson then isn't really getting back to you in that second round. So nice to get a Wilson share here to kick things off. Best ball, though, as we were talking about, since things have started off, I give a kind of very general answer that best ball now isn't a great position because it has exploded to the point that we have tournaments that need the strategizing beyond just the actual draft board and adding in those extra elements for week 17, week 16, and so on. It adds a lot of intrigue to the game, and it's obviously boosted the popularity of it immensely. Anything in the shorter term from that strategy element, or anything else that, other than like knowing one thing that would have helped win you, like BBM4 or something like that, anything else stand out?
yeah, I think for me, when I first started playing, I was too hyper focused on player takes, and we definitely know that being on the right players is a big part of it. And obviously, team pick the right players is always loud every year, and it'd be easy if we could just do that. But back when I first started, there were too many drafts where I was going into it going, okay, I want this player. This player is to play the best player in the next 12 picks, rather than going, okay, well, that player might be the best pick, but right now I need to do this because of structural reasons, or because if I don't take a wide receiver here, the wide receiver cliff edge is going to be catastrophic in the next round. So learning to kind of feel your way through the draft and understand the draft board has definitely been a big part of it. And I would like to think that I'm building smarter teams. I've been talking a little bit over the last week about reflecting on how I got a bunch of player takes wrong last year, but because
Still
I
had
feel,
success.
yeah, and I think as long as you're building structurally sound, as long as you're building decent teams and using strategies that have been proven to be successful, then you can still make it work. So yeah,
I do think that that's a key part with the build and the strategy and the structural element. I think it does give that edge to your rosters that it can kind of still work if those things don't come to fruition. I do think it's good to have certain player takes, but not to stand as strong on them that they have to be on your roster. And I think something that's also good is, rather than just saying this player is the player, it's the profile of the player that you want on your roster. So you're dealing in tiers and profiles, where you will have a player as the top of that tier and a player at the end of that tier to make those decisions. But it's kind of the profile of the player you want to have in your roster to build out the best roster, rather than this roster has to have Jalen Waddle, or this roster has to have Devontae Smith, and spreading it out that way. And you'll see that with some of our picks when it's like we're talking about Drake London or Nico Collins. For example, you could, different days we'll draft different guys. And some of the YouTube videos that we've posted with drafts for us are on the Rotoviz channel. People will be like, I can't believe you took this player over that player. And I could easily reply and be like, here, look at the last draft. We took that player over this player. They're in the same tier. It's not that we hate that player. So we are back up in a couple of picks. But how are you looking at this next pick? There's a couple of names here I know are priorities potentially for you, but it's an interesting round again.
I mean, we could take Josh Allen and pair him with Garrett Wilson for that week 17 stack, or Pacheco or Tank Dell are really the names that stand out for me. How about you, Colm?
Yeah, so we did get into a situation there. I thought we would get Flowers to us. He went one pick ahead. I would be, again, okay with passing on QB here at this particular juncture. I haven't been drafting much of our boy here, DJ Moore, at the top, but do you want to go with him? Do you want to go with Tank Dell? I think we go wide receiver.
Let's take DJ Moore. I'm quite heavy on Keenan Allen compared to DJ Moore, and I've kind of been leaning towards that. But I think it's a nice pick to balance it. I think I'm through 40 drafts in the Milly Maker now, and to have 2% exposure to DJ Moore feels like a potential pitfall. So
that's another. Again, I'm talking about the show that came out on Monday. We talked all about the Bears, and at ADP, Keenan Allen is my target, but I'm trying to get all of those guys on it. And similar with the running backs, I'm trying to get all those running backs mixed into the roster as well. I would probably make a pitch here. There is some names, again, at wide receiver or tight end. I won't name the tight ends, but I feel like we could lean into Trey McBride here. We could go the Dalton Kincaid, but we do have 2 week 12 buys early. Something we're running into in one of our FFPC weeks. We like a lot of these week 12 teams. The other wide receiver probably that would be in the mix would be T. Higgins, who's also in the week 12 range of things. So I would probably lean here to McBride if you want to go with the elite tight end. But what's your thought here? He goes.
McBride went for team on the 12. So yeah, I mean either Kincaid or
let's go with one of the wide receivers. I'll let you make the call here. I think you want to go T. Higgins. Don't draft Amari Cooper. Let's take T. Higgins.
So
we have another week 12.
You're firmly out on Amari Cooper then?
I've never been since his Dallas Cowboy days. I've never been in on him. I just think at that price, the vacuum here with T. Higgins, I'm taking shots on Jerry Jeudy later as my kind of potential way into that offense. Some Njoku in it, but I just don't have a lot of faith overall in the Browns offense, I guess, is the picture I would paint along with the Browns quarterback and Deshaun Watson. So I haven't been drafting Cooper over the last couple of years, and he's remained in the same range of ADP. I would have loved to get McBride there. In hindsight, maybe I was kind of maybe overly confident that he would sneak through that corner, and I think I would have rather at that point have McBride and DJ Moore, for example.
So you tend to be a bit happier to reach on these guys than I do. I mean, that would have been taking him about 9 spots ahead of ADP in the back end of the 3rd round. What's like the most you're willing to reach on these guys when you are within, say, the first 30, 40 picks?
It'll depend on which player, but in this, I mentioned Cooper there. Cooper, for me, it wasn't even a consideration. And there is certain players in this range that just won't fall into players that I'm really looking to draft. Again, not that I don't like the players, but based on the ADP that they're going at and the trajectory of this point, like Saquon Barkley at the 2.5 is not somebody that I'm drafting, for example. Pacheco, I wouldn't be drafting at his current ADP. There's some names that just don't pop up. So I'm more picking, again, like I talked about, profiles of players I want to draft. And when I'm looking at the elite tight ends, I do have Laporta and McBride as clear priorities to have on pretty much every roster. So I would be...
Oh, well, we're definitely doing that.
Yeah. at that particular point of the draft there, for me, it is 9 picks. But when I get into round ranges, particularly at a turn, I feel like that is the same round, because you're going to have to stretch. There will be points to the extreme that I might even take a player around ahead of ADP based on not making it back to us for the team structure at that particular point. So we'll see how we do here. The likes of Kyle Pitts might come back and be in the conversation, but I really do like those two guys. And when it comes as well to positional tiers, I'm more willing to make those moves, because if we look at where we took DJ Moore, it's kind of, for me, him, Tank Dell, and T. Higgins are the end of that tier. And I have like a good bit of distance between the likes of DJ Moore and, let's say, Deebo Samuel, who would be in the same range, or Stephon Diggs. So I'm willing to reach on, like, where that's where I was saying to have your player stands as well. Like, the ADP is set just obviously by the general draft population, but if they're wrong on a player, we shouldn't also just like miss out on if we think their values at that point. So I would take Trey McBride in the early third, and then obviously I'm not doing that. I'm hoping to get him at ADP when it plays that way. So that's the balance of like where you rank a player versus where you're going to take them versus ADP. So Kincaid didn't get back. Kincaid would have been interesting if we had went the Josh Allen route. I have been kind of trying to lean out a little bit of that elite tier of tight end, and I've preferred the quarterback. I've preferred the rosters I've been building out that way, and I've talked, like, part of that is if I'm trying to get 2 tight ends into the first 10 picks, it's hard to have the elite quarterback in there too. So that's something that I've kind of sacrificed at points so far this season.
Yeah, I'm still mixing in Lamar. I've been doing something like 60 slow drafts on drafters over the last week or so, and I've ended up with a lot of Jalen Hurts over there. He feels like a nice enough value. But I definitely get what you mean. It does feel a little iffy sometimes. We've got some weird team builds going on in here, particularly on the first half of the board, but we are up in 1 pick. And Kyle Pitts is only a couple of picks away. The team on the corner does have Trey McBride, so if Kyle Pitts doesn't go here at the 110, I'm willing to push Kyle Pitts around the corner. In terms of the players there, though, there's Jaden Reed, Chris Godwin, Joe Mixon, Juswen, or Kenneth Walker.
I would be kind of here between Reed and Xavier Worthy as the pick. I'm good to go with Reed here if you want to go that direction.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Jaden Reed. I'm just kind of cooling a little bit on Xavier Worthy lately. He's not really had a chance to light up camp or anything. I know he's injured. Kyle Pitts here yet?
I was just going to ask you, do you because we have so much week 12, do you want to go with George Kittle over Pitts? We have a lot of week 12 so far. That's the one thing I would highlight.
I'm good with Pitts. I think we can make it work.
Okay. Are we going to go then? We're looking into a Cousins build then?
I think we're kind of, yeah.
Okay. That gives us more week 12, but just we need to be cautious of week 12 throughout the rest of the draft.
Yeah, but I mean, like, for me, Kirk Cousins is on the fringe of a 3 QB build, and in this 20-round format, I'm okay taking 3 tight ends. I've been doing it more this year than I have in previous, and just looking back at what worked in previous years on this format, teams that made the final, there's so many of them that even though they went elite tight ends, still ended up with 3 tight ends. So, and obviously part of that is buoyed by the fact that Sam Laporta crushed last year. But
my point on that is, so we have Wilson, London, Pitts, and Higgins, and we're probably going to add Cousins. So it's just something to factor in as we move forward here, ideally avoiding it. Well, funny enough, I don't think we've drafted any of these players, maybe Reed in this FFPC slow draft we're doing together, but we have just run across week 12 after week 12 after week 12 by building out what I think is an absolute juggernaut of a roster so far. But we're doing the same here, and we're doing one of them from the 102, we're doing one of them from the 111.
Yeah, and I think, like, it's, if it gets us a unique roster combination that people are scared of building, then I don't mind that. Like, get plenty of questions from people saying how many is the most players you'd be worried about on bye weeks, and there's definitely a tipping point to it. But when we still have 15, 14 picks to make, I'm okay with that. I think that there's still plenty of chances to build around that and factor it in.
There is that slight element of it if you're going to have none of those guys for week 12, but you likely, without injury, will have them for the entirety of the rest of the season. And that there also gives you advantages on those weeks to have more potential players in the lineup. One of those in the FFPC tournament a couple of years ago, week 14 buys with Jonathan Taylor, who was an early pick in that season. That was a big dilemma for people. Draft Jonathan Taylor because the playoffs started in week 14. So you were getting them for the 13 weeks of the regular season. So there's that there's always going to be a tipping point. But yeah, I've started to try and get some more George Kittle into my lineup. So I wasn't targeting him as much, but I'm just obviously want to get pieces of explosive offenses, and they fit perfectly into that. Kittle has had some monster games over the last couple of seasons. Jaden Reed, though, somebody who's ending up on a lot of my rosters. He's another player that when there's that tier break with, you're looking there, Keenan Allen, who you mentioned earlier, but he doesn't get back to us. So this is a team now we can have the DJ Moore element to it. But even Christian Kirk, Hollywood Brown, Terry McLaurin, Amari Cooper, George Pickens, Michael Pittman, all going between our picks. And I'm not actively targeting any of those outside of Keenan Allen, and the tight ends then are probably the other targets. So I think we had a pretty good round to run back to us there between the Higgins and Reed pick, because if Higgins is gone, I'm starting to look towards Keenan Allen and Reed at that particular point of the draft. So we'll see what happens over these next 6 or so picks before it gets back to us. How are you feeling so far with the five wide receiver, 1 tight end, and then where are you kind of looking to go over these next couple of rounds?
Yeah, I think, we're approaching an area of a draft where I like a lot of the running backs, but I think because we're quite heavy at week 12, if a wide receiver value falls to us, looking through the top players in ADP, you've got Christian Watson, Deontay Johnson, Brian Thomas, who's got a week 12 bye, so I'd probably push him out of it. Jameson Williams, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, week 10 bye. So it's like, if I wouldn't be against taking another wide receiver here just to give us that kind of flexibility of a wide receiver position. Of course, Deontay Johnson, Jameson Williams, and even down a bit.
I think wide receiver wise, Johnson is for me ahead of all these guys. Jameson's interesting as well, but I do feel like this is probably a clear running back pick. Just show me tight end ADP just as well along the way. Yeah, so I think I'm willing to push. If we could get Bowers at that next turn would be ideal, but there is too many running back names here at this ADP, and I know you like Stevenson. You obviously helped him get that big contract last week. I feel like we're into a double running backs over these next couple of picks, and
so
Johnson also went.
Deontay Johnson's gone. For me, I'd be more than happy to take James Conner, Ramondre, or
let's take Ramondre and then see what comes back.
Yeah, out of these next running backs, it's James Conner, Raheem Mostert, Zach Moss, who I've been taking a little bit more over the last week. And then, or we could reach down as far as Jalen Warren, that's 8 picks away by ADP, or Najee Harris.
Yeah, I think we take one of the first 2 names here. I'll let you pick which one, but I would take either of them and play that just because of the ADP, that there's a chance that somebody like Warren could sneak through, which I definitely don't think happens.
Yeah, let's take James Conner. I think that he kind of pairs nicely for. I've been taking James Conner when mixing in a bunch of these rookies in rounds 11 through 13, because yes, if Conner ends up failing and not making it through the whole season, then you can ping pong that with the rookies. But also, if James Conner does stay healthy or only misses a couple of games towards the start of the season and you get him towards the end, I'm really positive about the fact that last year in games with Kyler Murray, he averaged 18 PPR points compared to 11 in games without him. So yeah,
even with the situation, with taking in Trey Benson as the rookie, I feel like the situation, like Connor, I don't feel as a player at risk of losing his job due to a drop in performance. I think it would be injury related. He's coming off one of the best years of his entire career. So I feel like at that point, having him and Stevenson leaves you with for not picking running back to the 7-11. I think that gives you a real stable floor. And I'm saying that one of the reasons that I'm not as in on Swift, although I do want to get him on some rosters, is he has had, that trajectory of he was with the Lions, doesn't fully work out, even though I'm a big DeAndre Swift fan, but it doesn't work out over that course of time fully for him. Goes to the Eagles, and obviously there's a lot of frustration last year with not getting in the end zone, which is kind of unlucky from his point of view. But now he's in the Bears offense with 2 relatively strong committee members with him. And I feel like he, if it doesn't work out straight away, they've given him a contract, but there's still a chance that he could get squeezed a little bit more than somebody, I think, like a Connor. And that might just be some, made up belief on my behalf, but that's the way I feel about him. For example, the likes of Harris, I think while he had a solid season, last year. I think he could get completely, bumped into that second spot by a Warren, which I don't really see happening with Connor. So while this is a tricky thing to say about a running back at the start of the season, he feels relatively safe, particularly in the 8th round. He's somebody, like, I've been talking a little bit more about running backs who would have been in the dead zone in previous years, and you would be kind of avoiding them. I feel like he would have been like pumped up into that same range here as like Pacheco, Joe Mixon, James Cook, and then he's not draftable. But when you're getting that same opportunity basically in the 8th round, I feel like it's very appealing.
Yeah, Tyler in the chat saying Connor is cromulent, Ramondre is Vegemite. And last night on our Underdog show,
I've heard of Vegemite. I have no idea what that first word means.
Cromulent is very much a word of the moment over on the ship chasing and other such channels at the minute. But last night with Tyler on our Underdog show, I was chatting about how often is it that running backs actually emerge from 3 running back committees.
Yeah.
And that's my problem with DeAndre Swift at the minute. Like, I don't mind taking Herbert occasionally or Roshan Johnson because it feels like there's a good chance for one of them to end up paying off their value, but Swift in the 7th doesn't feel as good. And Tyler giving us the definition of cromulent.
Very fine and not exciting. That for me, that's kind of running back in general. That's my running back strategy.
And if you're after more zero RB takes, we will be live with Pete Overzet on Friday, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, 8:30 p.m. here in the UK, drafting on Underdog. So do hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Colm, we're a couple of picks away. We've got our 2 running backs, 5 wide receivers, and 1 tight end. I know where you're going to want to go with this one, but he's already gone, Brock Bowers.
Yeah.
So at running back, Austin Eckler, Javonte Williams, Trey Benson, Tajay Spears, Devin Singletary, Brian Robinson. Wide receiver, it's kind of.
I think we're into it. So the other thing that Joe Burrow here is well past ADP, and we did talk about it being a potential team with Kirk Cousins, but we obviously then would rule out the Kirk Cousins side, but Burrow would be interesting with T. Higgins potentially.
Yeah, I think
we would only take one of those 2 quarterbacks, but if you have, it's either 2 running backs here for me, or it's that Joe Burrow selection.
I am completely fine taking 25 picks of draft value on Joe Burrow. I think, getting 2 rounds of value there is fantastic. Is there a running back you feel strongly about? Because we could always push Burrow around the corner.
The pick is, because we've taken Connor, we would skip. It would be Brian Robinson would be the pick.
Yeah. Let's say Joe Burrow.
Okay.
And then, because just thinking, if Brian Robinson went, I'd still be fine with Chase Brown.
Well, we're getting deep into the weeds on week 12 at that point. Then that's another week 12.
That is true. But
so we'll see if Brian Robinson goes. I hopefully he doesn't go in this next pick. Yeah, he doesn't go. Is there any of those others? So I've drafted a bit of Javonte. Tajay Spears is another candidate there. Have you a preference? You want to? I know you're liking Brian Robinson recently.
Yeah, I like Brian Robinson. I think he's just a really good leverage play against Austin Eckler, being quite dusty. The type of offense Cliff Kingsbury runs with no huddle offense should really.
You would get if you take Spears, you get Spears against the Bengals. Take Spears. Sorry about that. just for the correlation. How do you feel? I generally am between the 2 of those. Again, talking about tiers. Happy to get both of those players sprinkled across all rosters, but now you get Joe Burrow after ADP with T. Higgins, and then you're getting a comeback on him with Tajay Spears. Would you still have taken the pick there for Brian Robinson?
Well, I mean, Brian Robinson would have given us week 17 correlation against James Conner, whereas Tajay Spears has given us week 15 correlation against Joe Burrow. I know Mike Leone put out a thread last night talking about how people undervalue correlating week 15 and 16 compared to week 17. But no, I'm completely fine with that one. Brian Robinson's my slight lean in this area, just because I don't view the committee in Washington as close as I do the committee in Tennessee between Spears and Tony Pollard. I think that Tony Pollard is going to have a bit of a bounce back season in some regards, much as I like Tajay Spears, but I think Brian Robinson is probably going to clean the floor with Austin Eckler.
I guess I think there's a chance that happens. I still think that while I'm saying with the DeAndre Swift part with 2 players behind him, squeezing him out, I think there's a good, strong chance the team leans on at least on the pass catching downs towards Eckler for the start of the season and probably through the rest of the season. And while I do think he's beyond what he was in the past, there's still an element that I think he will be a player that NFL offenses like the Washington Commanders want to use. And I'll hold my hands up. I have been caught by this a couple of times with the dashboard showing the order of the correlations for the actual contest or the games over those course of weeks. So that's a bad on my part where I seen at the top of the screen and I obviously can't scroll down to see the other players on your side. So I'll take the hit there on the Tyjae Spears pick. Probably should have went with Brian Robinson, but maybe Tyjae Spears is the player you still need.
Yeah, I mean, I would have argued against it strongly if I felt particularly different. I just think, like, going back to your point about Austin Eckler on passing downs, I'm just a bit pessimistic that Jaden Daniels is going to be thrown to
Passing
running
to the running
backs.
back. That's
Yeah,
something that Zachary Kruger has highlighted quite a bit with the Russian quarterbacks not, dumping it off as
and,
much to the running backs.
and particularly when you're talking about running backs behind a shaky offensive line, quarterbacks behind a shaky offensive line who are in their rookie season, it just doesn't feel like he's possibly going to have that poise to just stand there and take the dump off instead of trying to create something himself when you're talking about a player who averaged something like 11 rush attempts per game in college. So maybe he does, maybe he surprises me. I'm still trying to balance exactly where I am on this Washington offense because I want to be in on Terry McLaurin at this price. I want to be in on Jahan Dotson and hope that he proves me right after last year. And I like Brian Robinson, and Austin Eckler's been a great player over the years, but there's just still a little skepticism for me in terms of how I approach Jaden Daniels. But through 10 rounds, we've got Garrett Wilson, Drake London, DJ Moore, T. Higgins, Jaden Reed, Kyle Pitts, Ramondre Stevenson, James Conner, Joe Burrow, well past ADP, and Tajay Spears. I mean, we got Joe Burrow there, past Jaden Daniels, past Jordan Love, past Tua, past Kyler Murray, and past Jared Goff. Like, that value is
It's
fantastic.
pretty wild. Yeah, no, there's a mispricing in the market. While I haven't been drafting Joe Burrow at ADP, when you're getting him at this particular point, it's they're the times that you just have to take those opportunities. Regretting that Brian Robinson pick a little bit more as we work through this round. Probably should have took him again. I'll hold my hands up on that one over the Spears pick. But we are up, and we just have to work through this. Like, obviously, Chase Brown's a target for me, but again, coming up to our conversation around week 12, we are in a zone here where, like, it's right at Kirk Cousins ADP, but we could do that and go into a 3 quarterback build. But we are 1 pick away. Blake Corum goes off the board. What are you feeling like here? And I'll not force you to pick a player at the last second.
I mean, I like Zach Charbonnet.
Yeah.
Again, that'll give us some week 17 correlation as well as week 15 correlation. I think I'm fine if Kirk Cousins fell to us at the back end of not these first 2 picks, but if he fell past ADP, then we could talk about it. But otherwise, Jerome Ford, yeah, or possibly even Gabe. No, Gabe Davis week 12. So yeah, for me, Jerome Ford or Zach Charbonnet, Colm, you got a strong lean on him?
No, I think though, just again, with ADP, you're getting a round of ADP on Ford. So we'll take Ford and we'll see what comes back to us then.
Yeah, so just looking at tight end, you got TJ Hawkinson, Cole Kmet, wide receiver Gabe Davis, Josh Downs, Quentin Johnston, before things get a little bit dark there. And then running back, Gus Edwards, Chase Brown, Zach Charbonnet. For me, it'd still be Charbonnet if he makes it around this turn.
Yeah.
Colm, are you happy with that? If
that would be my way to play it as well, would be through Charbonnet.
Charbonnet does make it, so now we've got a running back room of Ramondre, Connor, Spears, Ford, and Charbonnet. And importantly, none of those guys have a week 12 bye, so that gives us a little bit of breathing room.
We've got running backs for week 12 anyway, at least.
Well, I mean, if we can fill the flex with a running back in week 12, then at least we're taking some of the pressure off our wide receivers, where we've currently got 2 wide receivers who don't have a week 12 bye.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what does happen with Cousins here. So we have 1, 2, 3 teams the pick before us with one quarterback, and we have one team who pick in the spot before us next time around with 0 quarterbacks. But we do have the 2 pass catchers, that people will be generally targeting in that. Maybe the Bijan Robinson drafter, but he does have 2 quarterbacks at the minute, one of those being Lamar Jackson. Maybe they go and maybe pair him up there, but that's a 2 roster as well. So there is, I think, a chance that we see it sneak back to us. And again, not something I'm looking to do with having the 2 quarterbacks for the week 12 buys, but if the opportunity arises again that it can be on ADP and then add somebody else after that, like at the moment, we're standing at 1 quarterback, 5 running backs, 5 wide receivers, 1 tight end. And I think that like the running backs that we've been able to put together give us a nice room there. And I think we get up to 6 and you might feel fine about it. There's some later running backs that I would probably be interested in. So we may, depending on how the round goes, pivot away from running back here for a couple of rounds. But so far, are you feeling kind of, we're probably looking at a 6 running back build, and you mentioned the 3 tight ends earlier. There might be tight ends in the conversation at this next pick again, depending on how it plays out. There's every room you're going to see vast differences in how some of those like onesie kind of technically positions go. Cole Kmet goes off the board. Luke Musgrave's probably the last one before this next tier break happens. How are you looking at this? We do have to go past the Jordan Love drafter who may look to add in the addition of the additional tight end, but he already has 2 tight ends as well, so that may not happen.
Yeah, I think, where we're at the minute, it feels quite good. I'm not remotely worried about the running back room. There's part of me that if we needed to get tight end or quarterback into a good enough position to cover week 12, if Kirk Cousins did fall to us, then I'd be willing to leave running back room at 5. I feel fairly good about all 5 of these guys. We don't have any rookies. We've got a couple of second-year players. We've got a couple of veterans. And I think that mix of players, particularly when only 2 of them share the same bye week, it feels like you could make it work if you needed to. So yeah, in terms of where we're at coming up with 3 picks before us,
yeah, I think Cousins will go here, but what way do you want to think it through before that happens?
Yeah, I mean, if it comes to it, I'd be fine taking Luke Musgrave first and pushing Cousins around the corner to see if he comes back. I think looking at the other guys in this range, there's nobody who I'm particularly wild about. I don't mind, Jermaine Burton's there, but again, that deepens our week 12 problem. Kamani Vidal gives us a little week 17 correlation with New England, which feels decent, and maybe that could be the final piece of our running back room. In terms of wide receiver, we're approaching your boy Wandale. Other guys in this range, Roman Wilson, who's been falling a bit lately because nobody in Pittsburgh seems to know who he is, and then you start getting into the realm where you're reaching 20 spots on ADP, and I don't think that any of these guys are people I'd want to do that on. We're 1 pick away. The guy ahead of us does have no quarterback. Kirk Cousins still on the board. Deshaun Watson, Geno Smith, Will Levis. I don't mind taking quarterback running back stacks. I think that's something which is possibly underutilized at times. So if Cousins did go, I think, we could definitely still got options. Roman Wilson goes. So do you want to go Vidal?
I think we probably should go Cousins here. What do you think?
22 spots of ADP. I mean, between him and Burrow, we've gained 45 spots of ADP. I
think we take him. The other player would be to take Luke Musgrave. But let's go with Cousins. And we don't have time.
Okay, so if Luke Musgrave makes it around the corner, yeah, I'd take him ahead of Vidal.
What I would like to check there, but we just obviously didn't have the time, was the board to see which would come back around. But it is a 1 quarterback, 1 tight end team. So ideally, if we got that second tight end in Musgrave, I know you mentioned the 3 tight ends, but it, again, would give us positional flexibility. I feel like he's the end of a tier here at tight end. We're probably looking to get back to a running back if that isn't the case. But Will Levis goes, so taking Cousins might prove smart there as the turn happens. So if this pick isn't Musgrave, I think that's worked out pretty well. And I think we go to a 3 quarterback build. And I just think with the leverage of the picks and how it played out, not ideal to build out your quarterback room with those 2 players, but when you're getting 2 rounds of ADP discount on both of them, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Deshaun
so
Watson went.
Luke Musgrave.
I think so. Have you anyone else you would pitch for? I think we've built out the running back. Like it's Wright or Lloyd at running back, and I think we've built that out enough. And then wide
The only
receivers
other
in a
thing
strong enough
is,
position.
I mean, if you wanted to go Troy Franklin and give ourselves a bit of week 17 correlation with the Bengals and give us an out to Knicks, I don't mind it. Or Luke Musgrave.
I think Musgrave's the pick.
Troy
It's hard for me
Franklin.
to say that I don't want to. It's hard for me to pass up those Broncos wide receivers, but based on the way ADP is playing out here as well, I believe it is that Franklin's going first, Mims is going second. It's kind of different across some of the different sites and platforms, but we would have a potential shot. I believe he hasn't been. Yeah, so the two of those guys, they're going right at the same spot, but they should potentially be available. One of those guys at our next pick, and that's kind of what I'm plotting out by passing there.
Yeah, and also you've also got the likes of Demario Douglas that you compare with Drake May in that range. Like, Hunter Henry sometimes slips to that area. So I'm not too worried about finding a third stack with a third quarterback. I think there's definitely going to be options. And I don't think in terms of the quarterbacks left, the only one we'd have to be aware of is Derek Carr, who is a week 12 bye. Pretty much everyone else who is a starter is on a different bye. So
Could
there's
it be a
definitely
Justin Fields build? I just had to get that in there. I do feel though Bo Nix or Daniel Jones would be good options to slot into this roster as well. I think we have a lot of flexibility now as to where we go because you touched on it earlier. Probably 3 quarterbacks, probably 3 tight ends. We're comfortable with that, but I do think having Musgrave as a second tight end he's the last guy I think you can say. And I know people might have concerns around him with his running mate at tight end as well with the Packers. But I think that he's the last tight end where I'm thinking, oh, this is a player who you can go with a 2 tight end build if you have one of those other guys. And it gets he goes after Taysom Hill in this draft. And I know we're going to see Taysom, steal some rushing work this year, throw some passes probably potentially. But, I don't think that that's where he should be going. I don't think he should be going after some of the names that he's been drafted after in this draft. I have him in the same range as Firemouth and Komet. And Firemouth went at the 11-10, and we get Komet at the 12-12, and then we get him at the 14-2. So I think there's a big discount between those guys.
I think there's definitely an element of people are still, people are worried about Tucker Kraft when he's going to play, but there's definitely people concerned about how much Tucker Kraft plays when both players are healthy.
Yeah.
And we kind of really haven't had a good sample size of that because when Musgrave was healthy last year, the offense was still very much finding their feet, and then Musgrave got injured. Kraft crushed down the stretch, but then,
when Musgrave came back from his injury, he was immediately the guy at the tight end position again.
Yeah, and I do think that's how it ends up playing a little bit. But early on in draft season, when Kraft was healthy, I was more willing to take shots on Tucker Kraft in the last round or two and say, okay, well, if something happens here, maybe the price discrepancy doesn't need to be quite as big as it is. But at the minute, it makes too much sense to be just getting on board with Musgrave instead. So the teams out of
the picks to go, but let's fill some air. What are you going to filibuster about?
Well, I was just going to say these teams at the first 3 spots, which started off with CMC, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, they're all kind of in interesting builds. The 102 team went 3-3-7-2. I don't think I would have gone to 3 quarterbacks, but they've definitely kind of tried to dig themselves out on wide receiver. Their wide receiver 2 is Lad McConkey, wide receiver 3, Curtis Samuel. Then the team next to them, they did have 4 wide receivers by the time they got through round 7. The team at the 101 slot had Mike Evans, Christian Kirk, DeAndre Hopkins as a top 3. So I think we've kind of done okay jobs, but I just wouldn't have been going to 3 quarterbacks. I think, you're going to make that kind of choice for your running backs.
I think too, like Derek Carr's added in, but there's no other element to play alongside Derek Carr. I don't believe from what I've seen in that roster. There's parts of the teams that are just not pairing together in the way I would be planning, and there's not a huge amount of positional flexibility now the rest of the way for those particular rosters. So we'll see how they completely play out here, but not necessarily looking the way I would like to draft a roster. We have 1 pick to go here. It would be nice to see Troy Franklin coming back. Have you any other players that would be on your list?
I mean, I don't mind me some Rashad Bateman, obviously. There's nobody massively apart from that. Michael Wilson, kind of okay on. In terms of wide receivers, Demarcus Robinson as
yes.
well gives us some week 16, 17 correlation, but Troy Franklin's a pick for me unless you've got a strong lean.
Yeah, no, it's I love it when you can, push an option to the following round and he makes it true. So he was the name that you mentioned. Marvin Mims did go off ahead of him, and they do flip between drafts. But yeah, that was exactly at ADP. But waiting to go through, that opens up the door now for Daniel Jones. Not Daniel Jones, Bo Nix, sorry. But any particular players that you really want here? Are you looking to move into getting that quarterback at this point, or are you looking at a different direction?
Well, we've got Drake May, JJ McCarthy, Bryce Young, Daniel Jones, Bo Nix on the board. I feel strongly that
I
one
think
of
we can
Daniel
wait.
Jones, Bo Nix, and if not, we'll pivot to your boy Justin Fields.
Agreed.
I mean, yeah, I'd bang the table for Rashad Bateman here a little bit. Like,
Okay.
I just think
Bateman over Walker, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like Devontae Walker, and I think he's very much going to be. He's going to have splash plays, but I think you could be looking at a guy who finishes with 3 catches for 80 yards in some games, and you're just like, okay, he still hasn't made my starting lineup.
Yeah.
Whereas Rashad Bateman, listening to a lot of the in-house stuff coming out of the Ravens over the last couple of weeks, they talked about how the role which they envisaged for him last year, he just wasn't able to play because up until 2 weeks before the season, they weren't sure if he was going to be able to play at all last year in his recovery from the Liz Frank.
The looking back, the news around his injury was completely incorrect. I think it's the fair way to put it. What we thought was happening and what was happening, and I'm sure that's the same across multiple NFL players, and I'm sure that's the case during the season too, when how players are trending and how actually injured they are, probably been much more than we're aware. But yeah, Bateman, it was like, yeah, maybe should be ready for week 1. It's like never. He's in a lot of pain here.
And then because he just wasn't ready, as they were getting deeper into training camp, the Ravens pivoted and put Odell Beckham into that role. And then as the season goes on, you just lean on the guy who's been doing it, who's been in that role. And then Bateman had a few sort of snafus with little mix-ups with Lamar. So I just think that there's a chance, you're talking about potentially, touch wood, his first completely healthy preseason since he came into the NFL. And if that happens, when you're talking about players who are going to be on the field, I think he'll end up being on the field a lot more than Devontae Walker. And what we're looking for is players who can cover us bye weeks, particularly in week 12. And I just feel a bit better that Rashad Bateman hopefully could put up a usable week than the dart throw on Devontae Walker, because when it comes to fantasy,
they get the Los Angeles Chargers in week 12. So that's the shootout we're hoping there that Bateman comes true in.
There we go. But then when we get to the playoffs, I'm not really worrying about Rashad Bateman because we want these 5 guys to be completely filling up our wide receiver and flex spot and leaving one guy on the bench, really. So, yeah, obviously don't draft with floor in mind too often when it comes to best ball, but for this roster, based on what we need and based on what we've been kind of looking through, I'm quite happy with it.
Yeah, Troy Franklin and Mims, they're both players that I'm trying to get in a lot of drafts in this range, depending on how I've played out at wide receiver so far. There's not a huge amount of wide receivers I'm looking to draft. Once we get into the 15 plus rounds, there's probably 5 to 6 guys that I'm actually going to take. A lot of running back names in here that I'm interested in, some of those later quarterbacks that we're kind of discussing through. But I feel like adding in some of those players is the right thing to do, but trying to have your business done at wide receiver in those first 8 to 10 rounds is definitely the way to play it. So we are in a situation where Young, May, and Jones have gone off the board. We might see Bo Nix, who realistically was the player I would have taken based that we took Franklin. We now have the drafter that's in front of us again. We have a 2, and then a 1 at quarterback, so we may get through. Any other names standing out? We're at 7 wide receivers. Again, we could go to 8. We could go to 3 tight ends. We could go to 6 wide running backs. Lots of options, and that's the thing with the positional flexibility. The other thing, if he does happen to go, JJ McCarthy hasn't gone. Justin Fields hasn't gone yet. And then we have a few other potential players to pivot to, but probably looking here at ideally the quarterback. But we could, if we don't need to do that stack and we were happy with McCarthy or Nix, push that through this turn for an alternative. Is there any? Can you hit me with an alternative that will get me excited other than Will Shipley? Roschon Johnson, I mentioned earlier. He's somebody I find pretty interesting at this range, but right at ADP, we're a round and a half ahead of ADP on Will Shipley, who jokingly we talk about all the time.
Yeah, I'd definitely be fine taking Roschon Johnson in this range. I think Justin Fields goes one pick before us, Colm. Do you want to get cute and push Bo Nix around the corner with this team having 3 and take Roschon Johnson here? Or do you want to take
and
Bo
just
Nix?
last check, is there any tight ends that you want to put in the conversation?
Well, Mike Gesicki's there, but I mean, it's another week 12 bye, but not here. Roschon Johnson?
Yep.
I don't mind taking Gesicki if he came back to us in the next round and, going, because we've built out week 15 correlation, 16 and 17 with the Bengals playing the Titans, the Browns, and then the Broncos. And we have only single stacked Joe Burrow, and I do prefer pocket passes to be double stacked whenever possible. But we are treading that line with the bye weeks. Bo Nix comes back.
Yeah, so it's up. We are at ADP for both. You've taken Bo Nix. I was going to say we are at ADP for both of them. The one advantage there is you could go with 2 tight ends if we really, really had to. If we didn't get a tight end through these next 2 picks, Gesicki would have fitted this lineup, and he's another player that I've always been in on, but it's never fully come to fruition. I did slightly aim towards making a pitch recently that neither was Evan Ingram didn't hit the true heights that he's had over the last 2 seasons. That he went to Jacksonville, and we had a lot of hope with him when he was with the Giants, but it's happened even less so far throughout this point of his career to Mike Gesicki. So maybe that won't happen, but he's in a great situation with the Bengals. So who knows? Maybe we get lucky and he sneaks around. But the drafter that we did mention that had only no quarterbacks, at the point we're kind of discussing who would get to us. When we took Cousins, he did go Roman Wilson, Wright, and Davis at running back, but he went Young, Fields, and McCarthy. So he's, got some interesting quarterbacks and values there at the position that could, I don't necessarily know if the players that he's drafted around that are going to build it, but he's drafted quite a few, rookies and young players, which is something that we like to do on our roster. So I like the kind of the plan that he has had here in the back half of the draft. Scroll up just till I see the top of the draft board. They did take AJ Brown, Gibbs, Flowers, Pacheco, Mixon, Worthy, Ferguson, Brian Thomas, Shaheed, then Firemouth. There's a lot of names in there that I'm kind of interested in. There's other names that I'm not drafting. But overall, in terms of I have drafted rosters and waited on quarterback like that. I think Tom, me and you really pushed the boat out one day at quarterback. But so, I like to have different approaches. It's an 8 wide receiver, 2 tight end, 3 quarterback, 5 running back team so far. So I like that there's, a plan there as they work through that roster as to how they were going to play it. And,
definitely. And with Bo Nix, I know we could have possibly pushed it, but there was still about 5 teams that had 2 quarterbacks at the time. And
I would have pushed that, I think, if we had 2 different quarterback buys, for example. But
that's exactly
we're kind of, yeah. And also you get the Franklin correlation as well with it. But no, just when you have the 2 quarterbacks, you could go and take a 0 at QB that week and play it out that way. But the quarterbacks left are Wilson, Minshew, O'Connell, Lance, Darnold, Penix, Flacco, Brissett, which in Superflex, I think are all options to be adding to your roster. But in single quarterback leagues, it gets quite hard adding these names to the roster.
Yeah, exactly. I think it would have had to be a wait, and then probably one of the Las Vegas guys in round 20 as a dart throw. But
then we're looking at week 12 as the only week that we're going to need the quarterback. Now with somebody like Nix, maybe he does get in over those other guys at certain points of the season. But the trouble with the Las Vegas guys is you can't really tell which of those is going to be the starter at the start and at the midpoint and the end of the season. So even just with performance related changes, without even factoring in injury. So that is a little bit of a challenge there. So I'm glad that we made that pick. Zach Ertz is the only tight end drafted since we made that pick. We could get very fortunate here and get a Mike Gesicki, and I wouldn't be concerned taking Gesicki based on the 2 tight ends we have are already not at the same bye week. So it would lead us to having 2 of those guys at the same bye week, but Luke Musgrave will step up there to deliver it for us. But there's a couple of running backs not coming up also of quite keen interest here.
Yeah,
Mike Gesicki did get drafted.
Yeah, Mike Gesicki went off the board. In terms of the running back room, I was taking a bit of Tank Bigsby, but I've kind of eased off after some negative OTA reports. I do like Alexander Mattison. I've been taking a bit of Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Then I don't really end up scrolling down too much at this point in the draft. But
let's go back to the wide receivers. Just go to the flex, maybe.
So yeah, Juwan Johnson, plenty of news out there, some whispers that he might have a foot injury that's worse than they've talked about so far, and he might miss a few games.
So we only have 2 picks left, so I wouldn't be too pushed on the ADP side of things here. But any interest in the Giants tight ends? Not particularly for me. Like, the names here aren't really jumping out. I feel like we're probably into 2 tight end conversation. We could go with Dulcich in the 20th. That would be the way I'd probably play it. Have you a running back that you want to take? I feel like it's running back's probably the way to go with what's available.
Alexander Mattison's the one I've lent towards the most. Are you okay with that?
Okay.
I just think he's being undervalued compared to Zamir White. I think, yes, last year he was god-awful, but I don't think he's actually necessarily that bad. You mentioned the Giants front tight ends. Theo Johnson goes. Do you want Daniel Bellinger or any?
Well, the other player you could go with Dulcich for the correlation there with the. You have to type him in. Do you have any interest in him?
Yeah, I mean, I'm at 13%, 15% across all tournaments.
It's kind of a bet, but it's also I do like, I've really liked him in the past, and he's coming back. Last year he just couldn't get healthy, but again, fitting in with the Bo Nix side of things. I just wish we get a healthy season from him. The problem is that he hasn't. He was on IR twice last season, came back for a couple of snaps, back on IR again. But when we're in that range, he was somebody last year who I was drafting in that kind of 12 through 14 range and had a lot off him. So drafting, Sam Laporta, him and Trey McBride, and they were all in that same kind of cohort of like, these are guys I think could really make a huge step up into the upper end of the tight end rankings. But he just obviously was injured all season. And sometimes an injury like that just rules everything out and it never comes back, in terms of your opportunity on the offense. But I think that if he can be healthy, he can be a contributor here. So we do end up with 3-7-7-3. I didn't have any other clear players that I really wanted at the other positions at that particular point of the draft. I would have liked to see Will Shipley come back to us. He did go, half a round before us. Then Mike Gesicki went. They were kind of the 2 players. Jelani Woods at tight end is somebody who could be interesting as well. He was 2 picks before us. None of the names really going after. You have Malik Washington with the Dolphins could be interesting, but nothing that I'm really jumping to have on the roster. You mentioned Bigsby. He's somebody I think should be sprinkled in 2 rosters as well. But yeah, how do you feel? The one pick I felt bad about then was the force pick of Spears over Robinson. Maybe we shouldn't have done that, but we did then push quarterback multiple rounds. We pushed Franklin. I was able to kind of get some redemption for pushing players around to the next pick. So how do you feel about the roster here overall? And do you forget for the skip of Brian Robinson?
Well, I mean, just going back to the last rounds, the only players I would have taken were possibly Josh Reynolds or Cedric Tillman for a little week 17 correlation. But I'm fine with Dulcich because our tight end room, could be a little fragile.
Are you ready for this? I talked about the Tennessee Titans. The reason I wanted that correlation for Cincinnati was so we could have, that week 15. Talk to me about week 17, Denver versus Cincinnati.
Yeah. So we've got Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, Bo Nix, Troy Franklin, Greg Dulcich. So
it's on. We have a full lineup. We're basically playing, it's a showdown slate for us.
I mean, you definitely do have to have running backs as well. But when we look at
not with the points those guys are going to score.
But we've got Zach Charbonnet playing against Roshan Johnson and DJ Moore as well in week 17. So there's plenty of correlation there. But no, we've got the Bengals correlated across week 15, 16, 17. So
we wouldn't have that without Spears, you say? That's the
exactly. And I mean, I've been taking more Brian Robinson, and that's where I kind of lean on that one, as I said before. But I'm completely fine with Tajay Spears. I really like him. He was somebody that I was being quite aggressive on in dynasty leagues pre Austin Eckler, and I felt a little shitty briefly when Austin Eckler signed, only to feel like, no, this is completely fine. But ended up with Garrett Wilson, Drake London, DJ Moore, T. Higgins, Jaden Reed, Kyle Pitts, Ramondre Stevenson, James Conner, Joe Burrow, Tajay Spears, Jerome Ford, Zach Charbonnet, Kirk Cousins, Luke Musgrave, Troy Franklin, Rashad Bateman, Roshan Johnson, Bo Nix, Alexander Mattison, and Greg Dulcich. For me, it's a very fun team. Like, we definitely push the boundaries of what we could do and what we could work around at bye weeks at times. But I think we kind of successfully navigated it, having Joe Burrow 24 picks past ADP, Kirk Cousins 20 picks past ADP is.
And I would highlight as well in some of these drafts, like, you do have a Pitts and London team, you want to try and get the quarterback on it, but sometimes because you have the two players, I kind of mentioned this during the draft, you do see those guys falling sometimes. It won't always work, but you can, try and build out a team like that. So we would have had to skip on Charbonnet potentially to get Cousins, or skip on Ford, but then you can get both of those guys and then take him at that point. And again, it won't always work out, but you can build teams that have additional edges in them by doing that. The same with that Franklin selection with, Musgrave, how we pushed that one around. So that I think there's times where we make those calls where we say this guy might get pushed around and it doesn't work out. But in this draft, we got a lot of things that came back to us. So the other thing is sometimes you're on the clock and there's nobody that you want to pick. I didn't feel like that at really any point of this draft. We had players that we wanted making it. That when it's on the clock and you think, the player we really want's going here just before us. But we still had, like, every time we had additional options. It wasn't that we just got caught with that was the guy we had to have, as you mentioned at the start of the stream.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I feel really, really good about this roster. It is the first roster we've drafted in the last few weeks without Trey McBride or Will Shipley. So it's
that
nice
will be the no Trey McBride. It's a 4 out of 10 for me here for this roster.
But in terms of everything else, there's no selections where I look at them and go, I wish we did something different there. Like, you go through it, and Ramondre Stevenson felt like the right pick in the 7th round. James Conner felt like the right pick in the 8th round. I could have made an argument for Jameson Williams to give us a little bit of breathing room on week 12 at that point in the draft, but how it turned out, yes, we are relying on one of Troy Franklin or Rashad Bateman to give us that breathing room, perhaps, but I feel fine about that. I think with a 3-7-7-3 build overall, it's quite nice and balanced, and it should work, and it should be a juggernaut before week 12 and give us enough breathing room that week that even if we drop 30 points that week, that we're still absolutely smashing this league.
Yeah, hopefully. The other part you mentioned, potentially taking Jameson Williams, but there's a lot of wide receivers from that point on, again, that I'm not adding to many rosters for 3 rounds. And that's kind of where you're getting those running backs, potentially getting those quarterbacks. And the other part then is, because we've done that, again, and this is just the players that I want to get, but I found sometimes that I'm drafting Mims, as I mentioned, or I'm drafting those Denver Broncos wide receivers, some of the Giants wide receivers. And what happens then is there's only a certain amount of names that I want to draft a wide receiver in those last 6 rounds. But the thing is if you don't take your running back there, I'm finding there's a lot more, the team is much more balanced if you make that pivot there to Connor versus taking even if you just said Williams, we have, Mostert, we'd have to pass on, Warren, we'd have to pass on. I just find it hard to pass those guys up at that point with the 5 wide receivers to start. But yeah, fun team. Hopefully this one makes a run at it.
Yeah, definitely. So Colm, we'll leave that pretty much there. In terms of the rest of the week, what have you got going on with Rotoviz?
So we have recorded some of the shows already. We did a show yesterday where we talked about the Bears, kind of breaking down their offensive outlook for the season on Rotoviz Overtime, and then we have a show coming out, as I mentioned at the start, talking about the MFL 10 of death. So there's some interesting player, ADPs in that people might be interested in. So that'll come out on the Wednesday edition. So subscribe to Rotoviz Overtime. Check out the Rotoviz YouTube channel. You find all of our stuff over there. But it's always up as a podcast, usually a couple of days in advance of the video stuff, unless it's a live stream. So get them nice and quick on the podcast side.
Yeah, in terms of this channel, Rich just put out a new Dynasty video looking at the sophomore wide receivers today. Highly recommend you go and check that one out. That is excellent, featuring Kevin Coleman of the Devi Royale. I will be back on Wednesday, 4 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. UK time for another DraftKings draft. And then on Friday, for a little best ball happy hour, Pete Overzet will be joining myself and Tyler at draft on Underdog at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, 8:30 p.m. UK. Loads more content as well. Some special individual videos coming your way. Appreciate everyone checking us out. Hit the like, hit the subscribe button, and we'll be back next week.